Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a big day. We get to have Oliver here. Before we start today, I'd just really like to acknowledge the fact that they led comments to people on whose traditional territory the university stands. And the song uses by Multan Wasanich people whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. So Oliver doesn't need a massive introduction, but let's just do a couple of things. He's been at the center since 2012, so we've been working with him for over a decade now, and that was an interim director, and then as the center's director since 2013. Oliver's a professor, got a couple of hats in different departments, one in the political science and the other in history. And he's also the co-lead, and he's part of this project quite a bit. As we've been trying to do is the Europe, Canada, Networking project, which is pretty apt for today's research. He has his PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, taught at Humboldt, Berlin before joining UVic. So for a couple decades now, you've had your research and been a visiting scholar at Harvard, Bonn, and lots of places actually. So really, Oliver, your current research is a lot on the field of comparative European politics, contemporary history, migration, integration, and evolving identities and collective memory in modern society, which is really what you're going to be sort of touching on today. Oliver did a sabbatical last year in Europe, and I think some of what you're speaking to will, kind of touch on both the fact that your research, but also that you were physically in place during the Russia's attack on the Ukraine, which is really a year ago right now. So Oliver's presentation is on memory, identity, and a new geopolitical. If I turn it over to you, and if I forgot anything in your plan that you want to share, let me know.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so thanks, It's strange to be now presenting instead of introducing, but it's a great pleasure that you could make it. And those of you online, thank you very much for coming. And as Jody already suggested, I thought I would use this session to reflect a bit on my experience while being on sabbatical in Europe. That's when the Russian attack against Ukraine happened in February of last year. And we probably share this impression that we read about the horrific events unfolding, in the center of Europe, and we've come bit numb and used to this, seeing this in the news, but clearly something that has taken up some thinking and some reflection. You will see also how it challenges me as someone having been socialized in Germany that had a very different trajectory. So I will also touch on the different reactions to the war and Germany's controversial role in supporting, but also being hesitant about sending weapons to Ukraine. And then, I invite you really as an open discussion to share your reflections on what's happening there and how we could possibly also get out of a situation that seems to see one new round of escalation in terms of military confrontation after the other. So I could have spoken about my current research on populism, democracy. These are some journal articles from last year. That would have been a more scholarly presentation, but I thought some of you might have heard this, but also, maybe a bit more engaging to invite you to think with me about global politics as it unfolds. And very recently, I'm promoting myself here, but that has come out that just 3 days ago, an article that we were going to circulate as well. So it gives you a sense of what I've been thinking in more theoretical terms, but I thought beginning of February you might be tired and too much theory and too much, too scholarly a presentation might be a bit challenging. So I thought, all right, let's go for something that still is try to make sense also in some theoretical terms, but really it is a reflection on ongoing events. We had some sessions dedicated to Ukraine, but I think it's good timing now to think where we're at. And I still would like to relate this to an ongoing research that we have. And Jody alluded already to the UCANet website, and one of the projects that we try to promote and give public visibility is one on memory politics. And in a way, how I'd like to introduce and the reflection on the Ukrainian case is through a particular lens. If you listen to the news, you see lots of retired general now come to speak about the issue, but I definitely want to take a slightly different perspective, trying to come to terms what's happening, and how we might also get out of this mess at some stage. So what I'd like to focus on, and this is the central aspiration and intellectual question guiding our project of memory politics with partners in Europe, is to think about how history and historical memory is being mobilized for contemporary purposes. And the citation here from Levy and Rothberg gives you a sense of how I see history as a critical site of contention among political imaginings. So the idea here is that history provides us with critical narratives with which we make sense of our world. Max Weber, a German anthropologist, once described how people tell themselves stories. That is how individuals, in a way, position themselves in a social context. But if you think about collectives and political dynamics, there's something very similar going on. That the way we define who we are as a political community, key political aspirations, as a polity, we refer to history and, in a way, create a continuity through time that provides legitimacy and coherence to who we are as a people and our key political aspirations. What I've seen lately in public discourse is the increasing use of and politicization of the memory of the 20th century in key events, the heroic elements, but also the devastating effects of the Second World War, the Nazi regime, the Holocaust. All these memories are very much part of contemporary political debates, and they come to the fore, I think, quite forcefully in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So that is, in a way, to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And if you look, one thing is the political use, but even on the level of being taken back deep into the 20th century, you see these images of destroyed countries, of cities, of countries whose sovereignty is being violated by tanks rolling into the territory, occupying it, declaring it part of a different state. This is exactly what we thought we would have left behind, at least in the European continent, in 1945. So here we have an image of Dresden after the war and Mariupol in Ukraine. And these images are eerily familiar, and in particular in those countries that have experienced the horror of warfare. It resonates very strongly in the European context in particular. You see these images and you think, isn't this what we pledged to put an end to at the end of the Second World War? How could we, in a way, get back to a situation in which we not only see this massive destruction, but also we see refugees. Millions now have left, being uprooted from Ukraine and West, trying to find shelters. These images are, again, disturbingly similar to things that unfolded 70, 80 years ago on the European continent in particular. So in a way, even at this level of thinking about history, it is almost unavoidable to think about the legacy of warfare, of genocide on the European context, in the European context, to come to terms with what's unfolding in Ukraine and Russia. And also, maybe for those who might have seen this movie here, the new attempt to put this into cinematic tradition, the All Quiet on the Western Front, certain images that you see now, the defenses of Ukrainian cities, it's almost like you're going back into a period of our history that was so bloody, so in a way irrational in terms of the conflict, and you wonder what we have learned from history. So even at this level, the irritation and the concern about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, I think has touched on a nerve with particular audiences. One, you might know that tomorrow, 80 years ago, the Battle of Stalingrad ended with the defeat of the German army, the first real defeat of Hitler's invading forces in Russia. And I think this anniversary lets me refer to two things. One is the similarity of destroyed cities, reduced to rubble. That's what we see in current Ukraine, but also how exactly this narrative, also the heroic deeds of those defending the city, have become politicized and used in contemporary debate about the legitimacy of Russia's intervention into Ukraine and Ukraine's attempt to defend its own territory. And if we look at, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, if you look at the key justifications of Russia's war against Ukraine, all steeped in particular historical narratives. The first one being here that the notion that Russia is being threatened by NATO, by Western allies that are able to move closer and closer to its territory. You will have heard about Putin's complaint about broken promises of not expanding NATO towards the east, and it resonates strongly in Russia in terms of the sense of having experienced attempts to occupy Russian territory. Napoleon, Hitler, these narratives are deeply ingrained into the collective psyche of Russians and resonate strongly. So the notion that we are encircled again, we are threatened by Western allies, is something that Putin could mobilize as a justification that it is now essential to intervene and protect Russia. That was one line. The other one, and this is his famous speech on February 21st, preparing the intervention on February 24th, when he spoke on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and essentially denying Ukraine independence. The Ukrainian statehood being a kind of an accident of history granted by the Soviet Union that could also be revoked. Ukraine as an integral part of the narrative of what Greater Russia is. Too similar, it's the cradle also of Russian civilization here in the narrative. So the claim that Ukraine is not a legitimate country all by itself, that it really needs to be brought back into this greater Russian, what are called empire or sphere of influence. So again, very much history, lots of rebuttals from the Ukrainian side that you're very wrong in assuming that we don't have claims to statehood, but you can see here how history provides the narrative to say you don't deserve this sovereignty and all the international agreements on non-violating the sovereign rights of another country are null and void in the Putin rhetoric, suggesting that there is no legitimate claim historically to the independence of a country called Ukraine. And the last one here, and if you listen to the rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin, is that what Russia is doing is actually fighting Nazis and fascism in the Ukrainian context, and that this fight is very much in line with what the Soviet Union and later Russia is committed to in preventing aggressive, quote-unquote, fascist regimes to emerge, irrespective of the fact that Zelensky himself is of Jewish background and that he came to power through free election, and there is not much, neo-Nazi movement is not very, is there, but it doesn't seem to rule things. But here, it's a very powerful frame, and that is what brings me back to Stalingrad, but the attempt and the very forceful attempt of the current Russian government to use the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, the just cause to fight against fascism that goes back deep into the 20th century, mobilizing this as a justification and also as a domestic fuel to garner up support and to depict the internationally unlawful military intervention into another country as a legitimate act of preventing evil associated with fascism to take root in Europe again. again. So some of the old depictions, they relate directly to what we see today. And I think, in particular from Western Europe, you have very different narratives. This iconic picture of the Soviet soldiers having the flag, the Soviet flag in Berlin as the ultimate defeat of the Nazi regime in Germany. It is very much part of a very heroic narrative in Russia. This is the annual celebration of the defeat of Nazi Germany. It's one of the highest or one of the most important days of celebrating history. It resonates strongly. It's being enacted in schools, right? I think it's hard to overestimate how strongly this narrative of the Great Patriotic War is still part and parcel of contemporary Russian society, also partly for very political reasons. And in the West, this narrative is primarily associated. It is linked to the defeat of Nazi Germany, but it's also very strongly related to a recognition of suffering, of defeat, of in a way a catastrophe that had come over the continent. And I think that's as we go along, these narratives clash in a way in depicting what's happening in the Ukraine. And here is just a sense of how the public celebration of the Patriotic War unfolds. You see this all across the country. This is in Volgograd, which used to be Stalingrad, now a huge monument to the defeat of Nazi Germany, the victory of the Red Army. And you can see, and not by accident, that this place will be used this week. That's at least what media say. To see Putin coming there, the head of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, and the Chechen government, Kadyrov, all playing a major role in the current military assault against Ukraine. They all come there with a very deliberate attempt to make the link between the memory of the Great Patriotic War and what is going on now in Ukraine, fighting fascism, creating the legitimate narrative for the current intervention. There is even a very clear attempt by the government to push this agenda, the imaginary Russian script for reenacting World War II. So see this as a continuation of the conflict in the 20th century. And you see here, there is this directive given out by the Kremlin to say, liken, what happened in Stalingrad in the victory to what is happening now in Bakhmut or other places in Ukraine. And you can see this is a very powerful narrative that resonates with people growing up in the Soviet Union and have been introduced to this is our founding myth, how the Soviet Union survived, was victorious, and created its modern existence. So when Putin bemoans the collapse of the Soviet Union, it is also in this legacy that he tries to portray contemporary Russia in its aspiration militarily and politically. But he goes back further, and that's something, if you read carefully his statements, it seems Putin has read too many history books, and it's always dangerous, for leaders to think about their place in history. He refers back not only to the Great Patriotic War, but really Russia as an imperial power that you can see here more contemporary. So it is really, he refers to Katerina the Great, Peter the Great. So it is an attempt to justify and find a source of collective identity in the imperial aspirations of Russia. And if you listen to Putin, he quite openly says, they've sacrificed, Katerina the Great, they have sacrificed for Russia. They have been in war for so long, we can endure this, we follow their script, and I want to be, in a way, the history books in the line of these kind of leaders. And so that is, the pretext, I think, that comes through very critically in terms of protecting Russia from NATO, but the narrative of an illegitimate Nazi/fascist regime taking hold in Ukraine, and that justifies what we are doing. Now, it is also from the other side, and that is interesting to look at as well. So you see the Russian script and use of history of the 20th century, but there's also a re-evaluation of this very history in Ukraine as a source for developing its own national identity. And that is just a snapshot of a changing reality and how people remember and mobilize this history. And that is the Holodomor that we've been recently recognized in the West as a genocide that happened in the 30s. Millions of people died in a fabricated way, a famine in Ukraine at the time by Stalin. You can see here comparing Ukrainian and Russian attitudes towards this fundamental turning point or event in modern Ukrainian history that that a majority of Ukrainians say, that was a fabricated genocide, fabricated famine, and organized by the leadership of the Soviet Union. So clear blame, on Moscow's footsteps to say that was deliberate and it created great sufferings, and the responsibility based directly with the Russians and the Soviets at the time. Whereas in Russia, this is seen as a general tragedy of the Soviet people, as a result of national condition and accident, coincidence, unfavorable circumstances. So fundamentally different ways of looking at history and evaluating the legacy of the Soviet Union. There's I think one more of these, looking at the assessment of Stalin. And if at the moment in Russia, there's a real attempt to reevaluate positively Stalin's legacy, closing down museums and historic research on the crimes of Stalin and so forth. Right? Whereas here you see the evaluation of most Ukrainians with over 60%, Stalin was directly to blame for the deaths of millions of innocent people. So very negatively connotated. Whereas, as you know, Putin tries to positively refer to the Soviet Union as a regime that fought for the glory of Russia. I'm paraphrasing here. So very different ways of looking into history. And sorry, most of our slides are all pictures, but I have to give you this here, this evaluation of a pretty influential Ukrainian philosopher, Yarmolenko, who creates and has created a narrative that you find more and more taken hold in Ukraine, which is to suggest Ukraine has suffered from 100 years of Russian dominance, injustice. And if you quickly look through this, right, he speaks about a 100-year legacy, starting with the Soviet Revolution, the famine in the 30s, then the post-war period, struggle for independence. So he makes up this kind of long historic narrative. What we've seen now is not only a military intervention by Russia, but it is a continuation of 100 years of suppression coming from the East. You can see how this, now very differently, not the heroic notion of the Red Army defeating fascism, but rather people suffering from injustices coming from this very communist regime in Moscow. And you can see here, how he speaks about this evil associated with the Z, right there. So you can see fundamentally different and colliding narratives and reevaluation of the legacy of the Soviet Union that, in a way, drive these countries further and further apart. I had the pleasure of working as a consultant for a university in Ukraine for a couple of years with the Soros Foundation. And from the outside, when I was there from 2014 to 16, the similarity to the Soviet Union and Russia was striking. Half of the people, most of the people spoke Russian, so the notion of a brotherly unity between Ukraine and Russia, clearly started to be undermined. The latest 2014 Maidan, and then the occupation of Crimea. To see that these two countries are now fundamentally at odds in looking at their own history and then taking stock of what this means for today. And I don't have to probably remind you at the Z as this symbol of the military aspirations of Russia at the moment. I don't really want to engage here with, Timothy Snyder, do we see another form of fascism in Russia? I leave this to another day. It's very controversial and it depends on how to define fascism. But my point here is how the notion of fascism is now being mobilized on both sides, right? Clearly, you heard this. Putin says, we're fighting a fascist regime in Ukraine, propped up by the Americans, right? So forth. But here you see this Ukrainian journalist, right? She went into the formerly occupied territories in Ukraine and are liberated, and she talks to older people, and what they tell her, these Russian soldiers they describe them as Germans or fascists, a kind of direct link to German occupation of Ukraine during the Second World War, right? And the last point of how she describes this, the bitter irony that Russia is fighting today's war under the banner of liberation from Ukraine fascism, and then using the myth of the Great Patriotic War, so you can see how the notion of fascism is used on both sides, right? Likening the Russian intervention to the same logic of German occupation and the brutality, the depriving people of dignity, what we've seen in terms of mass looting, killing, and so forth, to the brutality of the German occupation, or the other way around, you have the same thing. So you have the clash of fundamental historical narratives here at play that demonize the other side, right? Keep this in mind when I come to my final reflection. How can we overcome this? It is about existential conflict. It is about survival of the own nation, existential threat to the own nation. That is the framing that is being used on both sides, which, as you can tell already, makes it difficult to walk back and give room to any kind of settlement or diplomacy in this confrontation. Now, let me talk about another country that is haunted by its history, and that has been in the middle of a controversial debate. You can see here, I think that is from The Guardian. The first one, fateful hesitation of Germany to deliver more weapons to Ukraine, allowed to defend. Andre, you're listening in, Poland is always saying, why is Germany not doing more? You have the power, you should really intervene. It's your duty, Eastern European countries, the Baltic state, Poland in particular, being at the forefront of trying to prop up military capability of Ukraine. But Germany has played a very cautious role in this respect. And you can see here, this is from Bloomsbury, I think, the one here, Germany's weak link in Europe and the paradox that traditionally martial people now stand in the way of every attempt to bolster the continent's defense and security. As a German, I think that was what we were told and what we hope we learned after the Second World War, right? To move away from this militaristic tradition. And now, Germany is being again accused of not doing enough, now sending in tanks. But you can probably see why the German government was hesitant, at least. The very notion of seeing German tanks being sent into Ukraine fighting Russia, maybe it is not so clear to people. When you have these tanks, what is the big problem? Right? The line between, on the one hand, trying to prevent, sorry, I come to this in a second, prevent Russian military victory in Ukraine and helping Ukraine to defend itself, and on the other hand, to avoid an escalation of Germany's, of the war, Germany's role in it. So I give you a sense of how someone's drawing on my. That wasn't you. Okay, let me know if there's something so stupid that you have to. But if you look back, try to understand where this is coming, and it just give you a sense of where Germany is coming from, and also being torn in this respect. Germany in the late 60s, early 70s, was in a position to say, or came to a point to say, we can't simply neglect the existence of the Soviet bloc and the GDR, the German communist state. That was the policy: don't talk to them, don't engage. What Germany then did, you might have heard about Ostpolitik, East politics, right, was a very deliberate attempt to engage the Soviet bloc and to work with dialogue. Change through trade was one of the landmark policies, right? Go over there, recognize their existence, and try to engage in trade, but also the Helsinki Accords, have them sign on to human rights, basically try to instigate change, not by confrontation, but by some form of engagement, let me put it like this. You can see here, Chancellor Olaf at the time, the iconic picture of him kneeling down at the Warsaw Ghetto. So opening up and recognizing what had happened in the Soviet Union, Germany's guilt, and then building on it. Sure enough, the trade relationship also meant very favorable material rewards in terms of the pipeline. You have all heard about this, Germany's dependency in terms of energy supplies, the two Nord Stream pipelines that are now not being used or blown up, so not very likely. But Germany, in a way, from this perspective, said it's much better to talk to and work with and collaborate with Moscow than to simply take a step back and take a confrontation. So that is also this fed into a broader political movement in Germany, very strong peace movement. And I brought up this picture. I looked for myself because that was my high school degree. I was at this demonstration in the early 1980s. I must have had far more hair, so it might be difficult to find me there. But this was a defining moment for my generation, right? So never again, no more war, and try to overcome the confrontation, the Cold War confrontation, not with more weapons, but with other forms of moving towards peaceful coexistence. Let me put it like this, right? So the threat of nuclear Armageddon, what was for my generation gripping. So sometimes I see today's fears, it brings me right back into the 1980s. Late, the older ones of you, Ronald Reagan coming to power, and the likelihood of a direct confrontation between the two blocs being very real. So this is, if you think about the German context, we have Ukraine and Russia, and then Germany being hesitant to be directly involved in the confrontation, although, as you know now, the next, I kind of come to the policy implication in a second. I want to show you when I was in Germany, there were over 1 million people coming out to the street of Berlin 3 days after the war started. And it was one of the strangest demonstration I have attended. You can see here, it was in the middle of COVID here, us in the middle. On the one hand, it was the old peace movement, right? Concern about the destructive force of war. It was about how can we end this. It was simply the shock of seeing military conflict unfold in the middle of Europe. I think people just want to come out and connect and talk about it, right? I think that, but then there were those who demanded more weapons for Ukraine, like arm Ukraine, and it was very strange combination, and you could tell the two fundamental, historically rooted imperatives of German political culture and German foreign policy. On the one hand, preventing another war from happening, non-militaristic, peace-oriented. Germany got rid of its military service. Its military hardware is really, it's laughing stock in Germany. Like it gave up on buying weapons. It's not, they entered the phase where this couldn't happen in Europe, maybe naively or so. And the other one is seeing a genocide if you want to call it this way, the brutality of military intervention, the suffering imposed on the Ukrainians. That is another, in a way, imperative of German political culture after the war, not to let this go unnoticed and not responded to. So what you can see here, what plays out very strongly, and I alluded to this in a second, you might have seen the doomsday clock has just been moved even closer to 12 o'clock in terms of potential military nuclear confrontation. So when Putin comes out with this announcement that we have nuclear capability, should be careful not to go too far. If we are directly attacked, we will use this. It plays very strongly in certain audiences. But again, historically, partly it might be military strategy, but it is primarily meant for audiences that react to these threats very almost viscerally and very strong.
And that is the other, I think that was a real turning point in the German perception of the conflict when the massacre of Bucha became obvious, right? What is happening on the ground, the necessity and the urgency to support Ukrainians, right? You follow the chat. So that was, if you Germany being torn between reacting to these two imperatives. And one thing that Zelensky does very well is to use history to push allies into, in a way, enticing them to do more. And this is, we had this at the conference in October, so we might have seen this. Someone put together these speeches that Zelensky gave addressing particular national audiences. And I could go to that, would take us half an hour. It's fascinating. So how in England, he almost directly referenced Churchill, we fight by the air, this, right? And then in the United States, right, there's the liberty movement and all this. This one is here directly geared towards Germany. You can see here how it resonates with the collective memory of history in this country, right? He talks about the experience of being divided, of being excluded, the sake of peace, right? Stop seeing these bombs fall, the necessity for German leadership to intervene with respect to the injustice, and here the main, in a way, commitment of post-war Germany, never again. So what have you learned, right, from the genocide of the 20th century, Germany's primary commitment to preventing this from unfolding in Ukraine, very strongly, right? And that the sense, go back 80 years, the Holocaust, Germany, pushing Germany into being more open to, more directly to you might recall in the beginning, the German defense minister was very proud of sending 5,000 helmets to Ukraine, right? That has changed quite dramatically since then, right? It was kind of an indication of the hesitancy of Germany to do more. Since then, and that is something that nobody could have predicted, I think most dramatically, Germany's chancellor here, I'm not sure what that was Germany's moment, but a fundamental shift in Germany's foreign policy, he calls it the Zeitenwende, kind of changing times, a tectonic shift in Germany's attitudes, foreign policy, to say we have, what we see now is an end of an era. And in his speech, when he committed 115 billion Canadian to military hardware, Germany, in a way, doing what it has tried to avoid, which is to rely more on military defense, he describes it as an end of an era. And that is, where my own socialization comes in. Maybe we were really naive about the threat that comes from particular countries, most notably here, Russia. Right? Maybe Germany lived in this kind of also very comfortable sense of, war can't happen anymore, we don't need defense, we're going to all live in a continent that comes together under the banner of the European Union, there's no more threats. I think it came as a real shock to the German audience, and to me personally, to be honest, to see that we go back in a way to the Cold War era. We have to now purchase all these weapons, be ready, invest in the defense of the country. Maybe it was all a dream, the Ostpolitik, right? It was a dream that you can overcome these real threats, right? And that a country needs to be armed to in a way, live in peaceful coexistence. Maybe it was, in a way, idealistic to believe this. And that came as a fundamental shock, maybe not so much in Canada, but in Germany, it resonated very strongly because it collided with the country's commitment after the war, its sense of what role it plays in the international arena. And even today, if you listen to the German chancellor, he's not very happy. He was pushed into sending the German tanks, but only after the Americans committed to it, part of a Western alliance doing this, right? So you can see the hesitancy, but it comes out of a particular tradition. And Andrea, you're listening in from Poland here. That was one of the experience that we had. We had a conference in Poznan, which took place in May of last year, so 3 months after the war in Ukraine. We want to talk about memory politics, but essentially it was our Eastern European colleagues telling the Westerners who came that we always told you, right? All the time we told you can't trust Putin, get ready, it's a real threat, and you never listened to us, right? And the Baltic states, Poland, right? They all, in a way, confronted us and said, look, it is the arrogance of the West not to have listened, right? And then we see this now unfold, and it really questions some of the fundamental ways in which we looked at international affairs from a Western, maybe naive perspective, right? Relying on the Americans for broader security and otherwise not taking stock of the real threat coming from the East. So, an end of an era, the Zeitenwende, the fundamental shift in German foreign policy. Interesting, maybe, before I come gradually to conclude, let me see. 45. I don't want to talk much longer. Maybe it would be much nicer to hear from you and engage in discussion. What for me is telling that if you look at this, sorry, this is in German. So support for Germany providing the Leopard tanks, right, the most advanced military hardware so far promised to Ukraine. Is this right? 54% in the German public and 40% say not right. So quite divided, but still supportive public. But if you look at who is supporting this, and I would have never, if you told me this 2 years ago, I would have said, you're crazy. The Green Party, those who were based on the peace movement after, in the 80s, that came straight out of this subculture, they're most ardent supporters of sending in more tanks, more hardware into Ukraine to help it defend itself, right? And it is the left, the more, left from the Social Democrats and the right-wing AfD, the Alternative for Germany, that are very, either supportive of Russia or they're hesitant to condone any support with weapons, right? So it is, and that's, one of the paradoxes I still need to wrap my head around, that the Green Party, so deeply committed to pacifist tradition, is now the party pushing the German government into sending more weapons, right? So it just shows you how this war has questioned some of the fundamental things that we have taken for granted. Let me, I also had, the speeches Zelensky gave to the Polish Sejm, just give you a sense of history, or maybe I skip this, so that's about, pull Europe out of the abyss, shared occupation by the Soviets, you can see how this works, right? Defend the Western values in the Baltic states. Zelensky is very good at pushing these kind of historic narratives. Say, look, you should be deeply invested in defending our own fate here. Let me start with a couple of final reflections, and I hand over to us in the discussion. So the first one here, I hope the sense that you got, and that's my observation in light of what I've heard and I've been able to discuss with our colleagues in East and in Western Europe, is how the current conflict, the Russian intervention in Ukraine, is often framed in terms of an existential conflict. It is life and death of the nation, both in Russia, that's the agenda and narrative that Putin tries to push. We're in the same situation like in 1942, 43, fighting fascism. I know it can be absurd, but that is what resonates and what is being tried on in the domestic arena to justify the intervention. It is about defending Russia in a fundamental way. We are being threatened by a fascist regime, by NATO troops, and so we need, this was preemptive, we had to do it, otherwise we would have been in a terrible situation, putting our independence and our very existence on the line. Ukraine, I don't have to tell you, right? It's either, they succeed in not allowing Russia to take over the country, or that country will cease to exist, right? It is a fundamental fight for its existence, for its very it's very survival. So how do you walk back from these narratives, right? When you have these kind of existential conflict depicted with respect to history, is there any way out? And you can see here at the moment there is no real push towards diplomacy, no real attempt that seems to be promising. The UN is widely absent from trying to negotiate anything. I think now, there's some talk again of China, Israel, and Brazil maybe taking some kind of diplomatic initiative. But essentially, we're at a standstill, and it seems to be that this conflict will have to be solved by military means, right? Which, if you think about its toll on Ukraine, on soldiers on both sides, it's horrific. But this is a logic we're in at the moment. It's very hard to see how we could possibly overcome this. And I'm, as you can tell, I'm as torn between the need to support, in a way, the ability of Ukraine to defend itself, and then the toll that it takes, and the long-term effects, the divisiveness, the also war is never good for domestic politics. It doesn't bring out the best, and we see at the moment Russia more and more sliding into a highly authoritarian regime. So all these implications that come with warfare, but there is no easy off-ramp, right, for this conflict at the moment. The other one is that it seems the rule-based liberal international order, and Rob, you can probably tell me that one has always been a very naive belief, but one that took hold in Europe to a certain degree, that conflicts could be solved and addressed on the basis of non-militaristic rules and non-military rules, that there would be a way of peaceful coexistence, and that there would be increasing agreements in institutions at the international level to prevent what is happening now in Ukraine to materialize. So do we see a return to this kind of Cold War logic of confrontation and potentially military confrontation, at least the investment in all these weapons again? And it seemed for me, probably much older than most of you, there's kind of a déjà vu of the Cold War era, right, which the hope really was that we had left this behind, but we might slide back into exactly this world divided by military blocs that prepare for the worst in terms of confrontation. And also the last one, that's more an invitation, maybe for some of you to get involved here. Do we see a new division? On the one hand, the Western Alliance has been remarkably resilient in staying united in providing joint support for Ukraine. I think Putin's calculation was it would be easy to divide the West. That hasn't materialized in spite of the high cost for energy and all these domestic issues and the inflation that have come from this so far. But you see a real rift within Europe between Eastern Europe, and I told you this anecdotally from our conferences, Eastern Europe that has felt not being taken seriously, if not betrayed by the West, to say, look, we always told you about this and you never want to listen to us. And we see also the initiative going towards Eastern Europe. They are the ones driving the agenda at the moment. They're the ones facilitating the export of weapons and so forth. So it will have a long-lasting impact on the balance of power in Europe. And there's even speculation that if Ukraine indeed will be allowed into the exclusive club of European membership, members, that we might see a real eastward shift in terms of the momentum of the European Union. But that is maybe a bit speculative, but at the moment you can see definitely that those two countries that used to drive the European project forward, France, Germany, this alliance is no longer in the driver's seat, and we see a new momentum in terms of initiatives and if you want, power in Europe. All right, I leave it here and pick up. It's not a scholarly presentation in the narrow sense. I don't have any primary research in this field, but I thought I'd share some of my impression, and maybe it resonates with some of the thoughts that you might. So thank you.
Okay, Stefan, why don't we go with you while we're waiting and see if Annalise pops in? Would you mind popping in?
Well, thanks, Oliver. It was wonderful as always, and I just love your clarity and insight into all of these things. And I have a question for you as an historian, and almost in a naive sense that it sometimes feels like 75, 80 years on, we're still fighting the extension of World War II. And in a sense, that's not wrong, right? Because you talk about Germany's demilitarization, but we didn't have full demilitarization after World War II, quite the opposite from the US. in the Soviet Union and so forth, right? So, and then you see all, who's the fascist here, right? So we're still arguing out these terms from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. And, in a sense, I shouldn't be surprised by it. I was, Never Again was a kind of bedtime story in my family, in my community. And so, that something 75, 80 years old is still alive shouldn't really come as a surprise. But I'm just wondering, as an historian, is that common? Is that normal? In 1933 or 1939, were they still basing their conflicts on the Crimean War? Is that just generally how it goes historically, or is this some kind of modern phenomenon in your view?
Sheva, thanks for the easy question. That's a tough one, right? To see how far back do memories last, right? But what I can see at the moment is an astonishing attempt to make use of these traditional old narratives, right? Go to Hungary, right? They're talking about Trianon, right? The end of the First World War, the partition of the Habsburg Empire. You think, who cares, right? But clearly it has political value, and it might be in times of crisis and transformation that we see these old historical narratives come up and regaining a kind of significance in contemporary discourse, right? So what we see at the moment in Central Eastern Europe, countries trying to redefine their national identity after the experience of communism, right, and European integration. What is there that would allow them to define who they are in the broader context of Europe? So maybe it is these periods of crisis and transformation that bring up these historical narratives, right? They might disappear again, and they're often, as we know, we don't longer have any people directly remembering really the First World War, but you can see even in this country how the First World War is being used for defining who we are as Canadians, right? So all the movies, there seems to be these times to give substance and credibility to a particular narrative. So I don't think it's a matter of time, right? But it is more a matter of current political priorities, political projects, right? And that's something that I find fascinating at the moment, where most students don't have a clue about the 20th century, but probably indirectly their whole sense, their orientation is very much shaped by these narratives. That's also the power of these narratives, that we don't really are aware of them, but they like a natural culture, right? They direct our perception of the world, and what we see as just and unjust and these kind of things, right? And so how many generations does it take to forget, right? That's I don't have to tell you with respect to the legacy of the Holocaust, right? When does it transform, right, from a lived memory to something that is being reproduced in public discourse and changes meaning? But that's, for me, the fascinating thing as an historian, to understand the changing meaning and who uses it for what purpose, right? Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to your general question about how long does it take to forget, and when is this a new thing that now it's 100 years. Stalingrad, think about it, right? 80 years ago, but Andrzej, in Poland, right? Katyn, the memory of the 20th century, occupation of Germany, Warsaw fighting, the uprising, very at the core of the redefinition of contemporary forms of national identity.
Well, I think that's a wonderful answer, actually, to an overly broad question. Maybe just to follow up, it speaks also to the failure of the current political identities. If in the moment of crisis it's so useful or necessary to go back 80, 100 years, then maybe what that's actually saying is the current identity of Russian nationalism or EU integration or liberal internationalism or Westernism, or whatever, are really failing people. So they don't have enough, there's not enough juice in there to inspire people to go to war.
Yeah, and that could be another reflection on how the European Union has tried to create a European sense of memory, right? A shared European destiny. It hasn't succeeded, so it hasn't overcome the national legacy in the European context. It's a fascinating attempt to create a kind of transnational, if not global, sense of shared memory, right? And that's maybe it doesn't have the juice as you describe it, right, to convince people, and then you see a revival of national narratives that fill the void that we see at the moment.
Okay, we have sort of three, yeah.
Sorry, it's all running back into my old.
Yeah, yeah. Three, so people are getting talking. So Annalise is ready to come in, and then we'll go to Stan. Okay, just 1 second. Then we'll go to Stan, and then Amanda, and then back to Stan. Oh,
I ask a question, just how many of you have your microphones on? And do you need them?
why? Because you did hear the thing.
No,
I thought maybe you both do it.
no, you know what, it's a light.
It's one of the lights. Oh.
Oh, it's on.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so
Oh.
tinnitus as well.
Okay.
The sleeping was actually to fix this.
Yeah, I don't know how to. Thank you. Thanks.
You need to balance.
Okay, so Annalise, you're up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm using headphones and sometimes they're not so great. So I'm so sorry. I did not mean to Zoom bomb you with like drawing on the screen. I didn't even know that you could do that. I was trying to post in the chat,
It was you.
but I figured out how to erase it. So anyway, that was very strange. I asked a question about media actually, but I want to shift a bit. And so I think it's very, first of all, your presentation was really, really interesting. And I really appreciate the sort of the role of historical memory and the sort of, imagined future, which is very much relying on a particular sort of notion of particular packaging and reimagining of the past. But I wanted to ask you, like, I think there's a very curious sort of us versus themness aspect to this entire conflict, certainly in terms of the way that, just in terms of the Leopard tank situation, how Germany was under so much pressure to produce those tanks. And this kind of idea that if the West and if Europe sort of, the soul of Europe is sort of on the chopping block, as it were. If the West doesn't sort of unite and respond to this conflict, and I was thinking about that in terms of the way the media has represented the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but the other aspect is sort of the silence of the media and sort of erasure of any kind of non-European conflicts or conflicts where non-Europeans are sort of being attacked, etc. I mean, there's so many, we could look at Africa and the sort of total erasure of what's been, going on there. So many other conflicts around the world. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to how you understand the sort of role of kind of like, so why is it that, we are being so compelled to see this as sort of the fate of the entire sort of liberal Western democracy project is, at stake, as opposed to, having any attention focused on other types of conflicts. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, great, thank you.
It's another not so easy question, but a great one for sure, right? And there is a lot of this, right? It is not by accident, and you could say this is a European bias, deeply steeped also in colonial legacies, that there is urgency given to conflicts that happen in the very center of the European world, of the Western world, whereas others are forgotten. And just to relate this to experience on the ground, I didn't show you the amount of refugees that have come from Ukraine into Europe. And you might recall that how controversial it has been in Europe to welcome irregular migrants in particular that try to flee from mostly from Northern Africa into Europe. Right? Highly controversial, very exclusionary, very often in the European context. But now that we see white European refugees coming, to Western Europe, there's a great degree of support, not much of political controversy, although you hear first rumors in this respect. A country in particular like Poland has been most generous of housing, I'm not sure, over 1 million refugees now, while before not allowing any refugees, in particular from Muslim countries, to come, right? So there is a selective perspective that guides policies, right? And that is very, very clear. And that would be, Annalise, a great matter of discussion and talk, right? The silences when it comes to these genocidal military conflicts, right, there that we see around the world, when do we see, the attention of the world community to pick this up? And when do we simply, don't hear anything about it, right? No urgency given to it in political terms, right? Yeah, so I can only underline your point here. I don't have completely it has to do with our prejudices, with our ways we see the world in our very, centric, Eurocentric, Western-centric world, right? Probably it has to do with underlying racist attitudes towards other parts. So there's a lot at play here, right? And there's no easy answer for this. But I can definitely tell you that for a European audience, this conflict has come as a shock, right? To see that this would unfold again in Europe. Maybe this is also part of the arrogance of Europeans now to say, oh, it can't happen again in Europe, but here you go. The things that Europe probably assuming that has overcome this historic phase of its development, it couldn't happen, it materialized right in the center, right? So genocides are very much possible in Europe, and the brutality that we see is something that a shocking but also reminder, right, of that Europe is not immune to things around the world, and that maybe we should be more open-minded to think about it in a more global scale. I'll leave it here. It's not an easy answer to that one.
Sandy, you ready?
Yeah. So thanks, Oliver, for this presentation. One thing I'd like to have thoughts about is how depoliticization is the driving force behind the capture by the Russian power, by the Russian state, of this empty image, because at this point, this is what they are, empty images of the Second World War and struggle against Nazism, right? Yeah. So you showed us this very beautiful monuments in Volgograd, like, this very muscle Soviet thing, but these are just empty, they have no meaning at this point. And tomorrow, Putin and the Twats, they're going to speak for hours about fascism, Nazism, but who are Nazis and what fascists anyway in Russia now, right? It's completely forgotten at this point. Fascists and Nazis are just whoever Russia opposes, right? And so I think the capture of all these symbols, which then I used to justify and legitimize the imperialist and other policies, is allowed basically by the fact that people just forget that these are political terms. And fascism is a precise, very specific defined political ideology, right? Yeah, and so right, and so you see, okay, so you see it's also like you showed us this. I wish once again this very interesting statistics about the Holodomor memory, right? So if you ask the people in Russia, if you ask the people who don't know the causes of the Holodomor, and if you add to them the people who say, oh, it was just like natural catastrophes, these are almost half of the Russians who were interrogated by this survey, right? And so there are no natural famines. All famines are political. All famines have political origins. And the fact that people remember such a political event as this sort of like catastrophe from nowhere, it just happened. This shows, how depoliticized the historical discourses in Russia, and this is what allowed this type of stuff. And so I'd like to have comments on this, but before I pass on you, I pass the floor to you, I'd like just to have one notice. This is something that worries me a lot, that it's happening also in the West. And so you mentioned Netflix version of All Quiet on the Western Front. I'm very glad you did. Yeah. So first of all, this movie is shit, but for
we need another debate about it.
But it's also outrageous. It's outrageous because it completely whitewashes the German Imperial Army, all the war crimes it has committed in France and Belgium. It completely whitewashes the responsibility of the German Empire in provoking the war, and just presents, so it shows Matthias Eidel like a sort of like nice, kind guy, that of course the Spartacist, right? And and it just shows this entire affair as like an unfortunate catastrophe from nowhere. The First World War was wanted and provoked by Austria-Hungary, the German and Ottoman empires, right? There are clear responsibilities. It's not just this like, oh my God, how did it happen, right? And then they portray this sort of like depoliticized, disgusting vision as pacifist, right? It is outrageous, and I see this everywhere in almost all historical films. I see that were shown after 2000s. I see this everywhere, and I don't know, I'm becoming paranoid, but we need to be really, really careful about this in the West too, because what happened in Russia is also happening here. Right? It has different causes, different drivers behind it, but we need to understand that history is political. And not just like this sort of like pretty pictures.
I'm just wondering, we have about 4 questions coming in. We've got about 20-ish minutes. Do you want me to collect a couple and then
maybe I can pick the easy ones.
Yeah, they've all been easy so far. Yeah. that okay?
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just go with Amanda and Sam and then Anjay's next and then Jen's. And I'll try to keep track.
I guess-
Maybe cut 3 or so.
Yeah, my question maybe is to follow Stan's is, I'm curious about the motivation, more, if it's purely more aligned with a personal agenda than a national agenda, so. yeah.
Thank you.
And then Sam, we will go, you will pause there and you can.
Thank you. So, I see that many of the references, both from Ukraine and of course Russia, are to premise of World War II. And since World War II are commemorative practices, about the war and the premise of war. So my question is, how effective are commemorative practices in a party situation like this? Despite many years of practices of trying to remember things that happen and trying to kind of dissuade it from happening again, but yet we still find ourselves in similar circumstances. So how effective are
Probably I can see, put these 3, actually they speak to each other, right? So then I can't agree more with you to say that history is, how history is highly political. It's always selective. When I go to the history department, probably some of my colleagues in history is about, this passionate collection of facts. They tell the whole story, right? And we can do this as historians, as scientists. But even if you start looking at history, the selection, the way you tell the story, it reflects certain biases. It reflects also an interest of the time, or the necessities of finding answers to questions. So in this respect, it's right. You hardly have anyone who could speak to the events as an eyewitness. Now they have become put into particular language, anti-signifiers, right? That are being used. They are quite empty, but you can see how you can project things into them, right? And Russia has been particularly successful in giving the notion of the Great Patriotic War, the heroic achievements of the Red Army, a lot of lag time, right? Into the current times, even 80 years afterwards, this is the dominant theme that you find in commemorating the 20th century, right? Germany, to a certain extent, the memory of the Holocaust and the responsibility coming from this, right? So, in particular, the state gets involved and pushes a particular narrative, right? It can be quite successful and have real implications, right, on the ground. That this is, defines primary values, principles, political goals of a community. And so, history is very powerful in doing this, right? And that's why you sometimes when you speak Russian, you're not even the same. It's very hard to even communicate, but because you come out of a particular narrative that doesn't allow to speak across it. And Stan, I'm not sure that's what you had in mind. There's clearly also in the Western community an intent to demonize Russia. Right? So it's also highly simplistic. But that's a different issue, right? A mirror image of this. But what you have is historical narratives are almost always highly simplistic, clear messaging, and they fabricate, historical truths in a certain way, right? For political purposes. You need always a certain amount of skepticism when you think about these, but clearly, they respond to current political priorities and of those in power. And, what about why is Putin doing this? That refers back to the domestic context in Russia. You could say that, Putin thinks about his legacy is in his early 70s now, right? He's, I think, very concretely thinking about what he leaves behind. I think our colleague Chancellor Olaf from here, he wrote this article in Political, and he started off with saying, if you see your leaders writing history treaties and history books, better start running. Because it is, this grand idea of what Russia should be and leaving something behind. And he's failing domestically to a certain degree, economically, socially, in terms of where he has taken Russia. So resorting to these kind of highly divisive narratives of the past, right? Instilling a great sense and a strong sense of national identity, of unity,
if the reality on the ground is such that, doesn't allow you to do this, with peaceful means, you can resort to these often, very confrontational narratives, and it generates strong allegiance. Like we come together in times of crisis. They're very potent in political terms, and that's also it's disconcerting and worrying about these narratives, because they come with this. I think one of you said, us versus them logic. Right? Identities are built on this binary logic, right, of confronting one group to the other. Highly divided by history, right? The genocide in the 1930s, Soviet occupation, and so forth. So very powerful tools in contemporary politics, and politicians know this, right? And I think Putin is very strategically using this kind of divisive narrative and putting it into action in Ukraine, partly because he sees also the attempts of democratic civil society groups. Think about Belarus 2 years ago and a year and a half ago in Ukraine, and I think he sees this as a threat. The West coming towards with Russia now, and also putting in danger his own rule, right? And so an aggressive foreign policy stand is one way of reacting to this, right? And redefining his rule.
Let's bring Andrzej all the way from Poland, and then we'll go over to New York. Sound good? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was so impressive. And I have a lot of notes from your speech, and there's so many questions that I would like to ask you, but I will concentrate on one thing. I'm sorry if this question has been already asked, because I didn't hear you well in the audience, but I would like to ask you about these historical narratives and some contradictions within it. Because you mentioned the narrative of the Russian Federation nowadays. They are presenting Ukrainians as Nazis, which is like the worst offense, insult for everybody, anybody in Russia, or in Ukraine, in Belarus too. But they used to call, and they still used to call, Ukrainians brothers, as a part of the Russian Mir, Russian world. And there's a first contradiction: Ukrainians as a Nazis, as enemies, and the second vision of Ukrainians are part of the same nation, because Russians are promoting the vision of one nation. Yesterday, your professor of the UVic, Tamara Kravchenko, published some information. That there was like an excerpt from a handbook for Russian soldiers, and it was stated there that Ukrainians are a part of Russian nation, but now they are representing interests of United States, and we should like bring them back to the Russian Mir, to the Ruski Mir, Russian world. The second contradiction I see in politics between the historical narrative between Poland and Ukraine. Before the war, the Russian aggression in Ukraine started, for 5 or 6 years, the relations between Polish government, conservative government, and Ukraine leaders were cold, really cold, because Polish government were trying to bring attention to some atrocities of Ukrainian insurgent army during the Second World War, and there was a vision of Ukrainians that they still deal with this issue before we could, or Poland and Ukraine could, create stable and long-lasting relations. And the third contradiction, Germany and the role of the Germany in this war. From Polish perspective, which has a memory of the Second World War and the German invasion, there is a need of a weak Germany, let's say, in terms of in military terms, yes. On the other hand, the Polish government is the first government that is urging German government for the more proactive role, for sending tanks, etc. And I'm just wondering how it is. History is something about facts, and it becomes something very elastic and flexible in use for political terms and political purposes. What do you think about it? Is it really so elastic that it can different for a different purposes in a different times?
Oh, I love your sense of complaining about incoherence. Unfortunately, historical narratives and their political power is not defined by any coherence in the idea, right? It is other things. But Andrea, you described, for example, the first contradiction, Russia and Ukraine. On the one hand, trying to describe the greater Russia, right, the community, and then what's happening on the ground, accusing them of being fascist. I think what is noteworthy is what effects these narratives have, right? To think about the next decades. Can you even see these two countries, right, developing peaceful relationships? This was supposed to be the brotherly neighbor, right? And now we will see decades of division that will result from this warfare and the intervention. So once established, these narratives, they can develop their own effects, and there can be quite powerful indeed, right? And with Poland, right, it's suffering in the 20th century. You've seen that certain things are being highlighted, also responding to current political challenges, right? So Polish relationship to Russia, Polish relationship to Germany, to Ukraine, all these things, they speak to also state priorities, let me put it like this, right? And it's not the coherence of this. And that's why historians are sometimes surprised that they have all this great knowledge, nobody has an interest, but then what's in the sun, right? When it is opportune politically, this knowledge is being produced, right? So it goes back to Stan's point, right? History writing, and in particular, how these narratives are being used is highly political, right? And that's the fascinating research question that we have been exploring, in particular, how more right-wing populist movements have used history for really finding national identity. That's in a way the core of this project. And just in case you're interested, we have a couple of new videos and expert interviews posted on our website. So you can see I'm very good at plugging these things. But that's and it can only agree with your description, right? It is not coherent. It's not nothing that you say, oh yeah, right. Yeah, has this always been people with a longer memory? They say, but 20 years ago that wasn't our enemy, but now it is. So these things they change, right? Indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really fascinating, and the questions have been great to listen to. So this is a small thing, but I wondered if you would comment on what seems like an inconsistency that sometimes it's an inconsistency in your use of the terms Europe and the West, even where you were referring to the European continent. And you talk about it's inconceivable to us that things could happen in the West, such as warfare. And you're saying this, and I'm wondering, where were you when Yugoslavia broke up? And Nagorno-Karabakh, and I don't know if you count that as part of Europe. So clearly, it seems to me that you and American friends had a sense of Europe that stopped at the Iron Curtain, and your confidence about the peace and the goodwill and so forth was actually limited to what you thought was the global West. Because when you look at the other side, Eastern Europe was actually constant political strife that doesn't end at the end of the Second World War. It goes on through the 60s and various, movements that are sort of pushed back against one thing and another. And then when the Soviet Union begins to break up, you've got more warfare to varying degrees within and between units or countries or whatever they were now are. So there isn't, if you're from far enough away, a really long, clear history of peace in Europe,
right,
if you include Eastern Europe, and you include its relations with founding nations. But this isn't something you commented on at all. And it seems to me, on the other hand, it sort of fits with your underlying theme about shifting the narratives.
Yeah, I can only agree with you. So I still remember the shock over the breakup of Yugoslavia and the war there. So that is, so at the time I was in Brussels as an intern in the European Union, and we had, endless discussions about how Europe should react. And it was probably the first shock because the narrative, in a way, I reproduced the narrative that, you might recall the old ones of after 89 and 90, that Europe would overcome the Cold War friction and then would move towards a peaceful coexistence under the greater, roof of the European Union, and then gradually include also Russia into also a security arrangement, which didn't happen. But that was maybe the false expectation and the narrative that many in the West, particularly in Europe, in a way internalized at the time. And that's in a way what I was producing. And that's in a way how Eastern European societies, they would often tell us, look,
we always told you we haven't overcome this friction. It's just a matter of time, and we have Russia just waiting to move with these interests, and then the Balkans, right? As another source of conflict. So again, what we just heard, a highly simplified narrative that the Europeans were just too happy to tell themselves, and Germany in particular, it resonates so well with his own idea.
But certain Europeans, that's what you're still not sort of taking on board here. It wasn't all Europeans ever, it isn't now.
Yeah.
It was for a certain time, a
Yeah.
certain cluster of.
Yeah, so, no, most definitely, and those, but for example, the promise and the entry into the European Union was in a way also a way to become part of it, right? Yeah, so what you describe is in a way a privileged Western-based group of countries, right? That describe also in its essence European integration as a peace project, right? And overcoming these. This is, if you think about the justification of the European, it was trade coming together, but it was overcoming, nationalism as a divisive force, and then building lasting peace, right? And that's the European Union received a Nobel Prize for that like 5 years ago, and so it is in a way a peace project that has been relatively successful. All the more shocking it was then that on the boundaries and in the periphery of Europe, if you want to call it this way, that's my again a very Western European perspective, right? To say, look, we've always had that conflicts, particularly the breakup of the Soviet Union, right? What we see, the dimension, in the southern hemisphere of Europe, of the former Soviet Union, right? Constant, right, forms of clashes. The conflict in the Balkans haven't been solved at all, right? We see this almost daily in the news, right? With Serbia, with Kosovo, right? So it is a comforting narrative. That's not what I was reporting, not a matter of stating facts on the ground. So definitely not, and that's maybe also one of the lessons that Europe should take from history, that Europe has not always been the center of peace, but the ability of Europeans, right, has been exceptional to engage in global warfare and genocide, right? And so Europe is very much, this source, and those countries have dabbled in exactly this warfare in genocidal practices. So in this respect, probably your underlying notion of Europe talking, from this sense of superiority, right? So it definitely needs to be questioned, but that it has been the narrative that has been pushed in Europe, right?
If you don't mind, sneak one more question in, and
And then we wrap it up.
Thank you very much. In your talk, I thought was interesting that you pointed out that the Green Party are the most supportive of this military aid, and so there is this West East within Europe, West East, or a former capitalist social Cold War kind of this dichotomy, I guess. But also it seems like this what we are facing now is something another kind of dichotomy, or another kind of sort of like this conflict. And it seems like this for the younger generation, perhaps, for example, in North American younger generation, for them to fight against the aggression of Russia is aligned with their fight against racism or anti-LGBTQ or anti-minority movement or anti-non-Western countries. In that way, I think it makes sense that Putin, you can see it as the enemy or dichotomy or the opposite of the West, but also you can see that it's part of the West, this something that stands for this racial violence, for example, or this kind of hegemonic colonial I guess not even symbol, the reality.
Right.
And if you see it that way, then it actually makes sense to problematize that, and then problematize liberal democracy in the same way. then, so we have this conflict, like a problem of the Canadian multiculturalism has problem. But compared to white supremacy, it's better, right? Because it doesn't kill people. Yeah. So you have to kind of like prioritize how we fight. It's all bad kind of thing. But on the other hand, so you have to okay, so Russian soldiers are killing Ukrainians, therefore we have to stop this now. But then we have to like solve other problems too at the same time.
And it speaks again, Jenny, picking up from you, it's a simplified narrative, right? That the West also tries to now come up with, right? We defend liberty, democracy, independence, and sovereign rights of countries, right? And you can see how certain countries in the non-global north, right, say, sure, the Americans now tell us, right, that we stand for people, the sovereign rights of countries to determine their own fate, right? So we still remember the military intervention of America in the Latin Americas, in the Middle East, right? So that's why Putin now plays also the role of saying, Russia claims leadership amongst the non-Western countries to confront American hegemony, right? And part of his criticism is also accurate to say, the West is not as innocent, but and as much only as a victim, but they have engaged in very similar actions to a certain degree, let's say in Iraq or so, right? So that again, two highly simplified but politically very potent narratives clashing here, and that's definitely playing out in Ukraine, right? That's for example why, let's say, Brazil yesterday said, we're not supporting sending weapons to Ukraine, right? Because we want to stay neutral, and we don't see the world as black and white as human. It complicates the narratives, but as you can see, it has deepened the divide on a global scale, right? Yes, you with us or you're against us, right? So this logic in international relations, unfortunately, has become dominant again, and both blocs try to define their historical narrative, right? And I can go into, but that might lead a bit too far. Some of the criticism from the far left, right, that would say there can't be any Russian imperialism; it can only be American imperialism. So, but that's a different issue. I don't want to go there. that we don't have time enough to explore this.
Well, thank you. Already 1 year ago, we did kind of when Martin was here, we did a talk on Ukraine and the attacks and how quickly it would be over. And it's really good to have this talk kind of with a perspective, both your experience on the ground, but also the broader academic experience as well that you bring to it. And you certainly got us talking. So thank you.
Thank you for your time.